It's time to slow down. Let your shoulders sink gently. Feel the weight of the day melt away. Listen now. To the sound of stillness wrapping around you like a warm blanket, a soft breeze whispers through the trees. Curtains sway like the breath of the earth itself. The room is dim. A candle flickers softly in the corner. Its golden light flickers and stretches, creating dancing shadows on the wall. Each one gentle. Each one kind. Let your fingers uncurl. Let your breath become slow and easy, soft and quiet. Like the hush of an early morning mist on a forest path, you are safe here, you are welcome, and you are home. As you rest deeper into the quiet, imagine you are standing on the edge of an ancient wood. The trees rise tall around you, and the scent of moss and old bark fills the cool morning air. The earth is damp beneath your feet, a fine fog hugs the ground, and somewhere nearby, a bell begins to ring low. Mournful, gentle, our story tonight begins. In a forgotten corner of the medieval world, where winding paths lead to small hamlets tucked into green hills and the stones of old castles, remember more than they tell, this is a place where cobblestone roads feel warm under the morning sun. And the wind carries whispers of songs no one remembers the words to. But there was once a castle high upon a lonely ridge, its walls aged and gray, its towers curled into the sky like reaching fingers. And at its edge hung a single bell, suspended in an iron arch. Long silent now, but once so long ago, it sang a solemn warning. This was the Leper Bell. The bell rang not for celebration nor for the call to battle, but to warn the townspeople that someone was coming, someone marked by illness, someone cast out from society, but never truly forgotten. Breathe slowly now and follow me into that time, that world where morning broke gently across low thatched roofs, chickens stirred beneath straw pens, and the first cart of bread creaked into the square. The village of Ealdenmere was quiet that morning, wrapped in a fog so thick it turned the world to silver. Children still dreamed in their beds. Fishermen lit small lanterns, preparing to walk the damp trail to the river's edge, and the baker's oven glowed from within, filling the streets with the scent of rising dough. But above all of this, beyond the quiet songs of waking life, came the low sound of metal against sky. Dong. The bell dong again. It rang, and the people paused, their hands still on broom handles, or buckets or morning bread. They looked toward the hill, where the castle sat, unmoving in the mist, its windows dark, its gate forever sealed. The bell only rang for one reason. A leper walked the path. In those times, fear often wore the face of sickness. Lepers were marked by more than disease. They were draped in shame. And yet they were human, so very human, walking the same roads, feeling the same cold wind, dreaming the same dreams of home, of family, of rest. As the bell echoed across the hills, a lone figure moved along the forest trail, clad in a tattered cloak, their face mostly hidden. In one hand they held a small wooden clapper, in the other, a walking stick smooth from years of use. They made no sound, except for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional thud of the stick against tree root or stone. But the bell, that old castle bell, spoke for them. It was rung by the watchman, a duty given to the old, the blind or the gentle-hearted, those who could still see the soul behind broken skin. He sat in the upper tower of the castle, wrapped in wool, a hood over his thinning hair, and when he saw a figure approach the village by the western trail, he reached for the rope and rang 1, 2, 3 times, always 3, no more, no less. The people knew they had time to close shutters, to whisper quiet prayers, to clear the streets not in cruelty but in the way of old habits. Passed down like stories around fires or songs sung to sleeping babies, the leper would not stay long, just enough to pass through, to leave tokens or letters, sometimes food left on a rock by the outer well, sometimes nothing but silence. Let your breath stay soft. Let your mind drift gently with this figure, this quiet walker, who once had a name, a family, a favorite song perhaps, but now walked beneath the sound of warning. The bellet did not hate it, simply remembered the plague that had once swept the countryside. The fear, the loss, the endless funerals that filled the churchyards. It remembered the priest who lit candles in every window, the mothers who wept into silent hands, and the carts that carried the sick through the winding streets, and so it rang, not in anger, but in sorrow. Even the trees leaned toward the sound, their branches brushing together like gentle whispers, as if to say, "We remember too." The traveler reached the old stone bridge. Moss grew between each step, and the stream below babbled softly, a lullaby made of water and stone. They paused, breathing in the wet morning air. Birds stirred in the canopy above, not frightened, just curious. And as they stood there still and quiet, the mist seemed to part just slightly, revealing the small village ahead. Smoke rose from a chimney. A child peeked from behind a curtain. Someone placed a basket outside their door, a simple offering wrapped in cloth. Not all had fear in their hearts. Some had tenderness. To the traveler nodded once, as if in gratitude. The bell stopped ringing. Its final note faded into the sky like breath on a window, and the watchman, with aching fingers, lowered the rope. He whispered a prayer, not one of fear, but of peace. And somewhere in the village, a woman began to hum a quiet melody from her childhood, a song about the morning sun and the way light always returns. The leper never stopped walking. They passed the edge of the square, took nothing, said nothing, left only a folded letter on a stone by the well. Then, as gently as they came, they disappeared into the trees beyond, and the mist closed behind them like the turning of a page. Let yourself rest now. The bell is silent, the story slows, and your breath soft, and even carries you into sleep. You are safe, you are warm, and the world is quiet once again. Stay where you are, still and quiet, wrapped in the comfort of this peaceful world. The fire has settled into a soft orange glow. The wind hums like an old lullaby, and the night outside your window leans in close, not to frighten, but to listen, because this is a story the night remembers, and it wants you to hear it slowly, softly, like the voice of someone who loves you. Our story now glides gently along the forest path, where the mist has begun to thin, and shafts of pale sunlight reach down like the fingers of angels. The traveler, still cloaked, still quiet, moves with steady grace beneath the boughs of the old trees, whose trunks curve like the backs of sleeping giants. These woods are ancient, older than the castle, older than the bell, older even than the name Ealdenmere. And they remember everything, each footprint left in the mud, each song carried by the wind, each cry of joy or pain or loss. The traveler walks here not as an intruder, but as someone known, accepted, even welcomed by the trees, by the moss, by the birds, who sing not with fear, but with gentle curiosity. Somewhere ahead, a squirrel stirs in the underbrush, its little paws dancing across fallen leaves, and the traveler pauses, just to listen. The sounds of the forest are many, but none are harsh, none are cruel, only soft cracklings, the drip of dew, the flutter of wings. Breathe in, breathe out. Let the rhythm of the woods match your own in the distance beyond the first line of trees. There is a clearing, and in the center of that clearing stands a second figure, a girl no older than 12, wearing a woolen cloak far too big for her. The hem drags in the dirt, her boots are muddied, and her hands, a small, holds something carefully wrapped in cloth. She has come alone, though she was told not to, though her mother cried quietly in the corner. When she saw the bundle in the girl's arms, she did not try to stop her, because some things, some promises must be kept. And this little girl with eyes the color of river stones had made such a promise to her uncle, her favorite, her secret teacher, the man who once carved her a wooden bird that whistled, who taught her the names of stars and how to press herbs between pages so they kept their smell. He had gone away when the mark appeared on his skin, and the priest had spoken soft but stern, and the village held its breath. No one saw him again, but the girl knew he was still near, still walking the woods, still watching from behind the fog. And so today, wrapped in early mist, she had taken the bundle and walked the path. She stands now still and silent, the cloth in her hands trembling only slightly. And then from the shadows between the trees comes the figure, the leper, the traveler, the uncle. He stops when he sees her, and the stick leans slightly as his weight shifts. He does not run, does not speak, just watches her, a breath held between them. The girl steps forward, holds out the bundle, a loaf of bread, a dried apple, a small wax candle, and beneath it, a folded paper, drawn in charcoal, a sketch of a wooden bird. The traveler takes it, his hands shaking, but not from illness, from the weight of it all, from memory, from love. He nods once, and though his mouth is hidden, She knows he is smiling then, as if the moment is too full to hold, she turns and runs. Back into the woods the trees part for her, the mist wraps around her legs, and the forest sighs in quiet understanding. She will never speak of it, but she will never forget the traveler tucks the bundle beneath his cloak and turns toward the path once more beyond this wood. There is another hill, another ruin, where lepers rest, where voices sing low in the night. Where exile is softened by community, the castle bell will not follow him there. Its sound fades with each step he takes, until it is nothing more than a memory in the back of his mind. A note held in the strings of time. Let your body grow heavier now, like roots reaching into soft earth. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift like smoke into the sky. Because far above this path, in the castle still cloaked in fog, the old watchman sits once more at his tower window. He has seen the girl, he has seen the traveler, and he has not rung the bell. He sits with the rope in his lap, his hands folded. His eyes closed, not asleep, just remembering his own son had once walked that path. So many winters ago. When the sickness came to their home, and he could not stop it, could not change it. But he had watched as the boy walked away, one hand on a walking stick, one hand holding a wooden carving of a bird with wings outstretched. So now, when the rope rests in his lap, and the bell above his head waits, he chooses silence, he chooses mercy, because the wind today is not cold, and the sky has turned from gray to gold. And the world for this moment is quiet. Not every story needs to end in sorrow. Some simply drift into silence and become part of the land. Let your breathing become even. Let your muscles grow soft. Let your eyes fall heavy. Because the world of Ealdenmere fades now back into mist, back into dream, and the traveler, the girl, the watchman, all step gently into memory where bells no longer ring in warning. But in peace, you are safe, you are loved, and you are home. The morning stretched itself across the land like a soft cloth laid upon a table, and the last of the fog slipped away between the hills like a sigh, too tired to stay, and the forest opened gently to light that shimmered on every leaf as if the world had been newly washed in golden waters. And within this world our traveler walked slowly, steadily, quietly, each step a whisper, each breath prayer, not of words but of movement and presence. For though they were cast out, they still belonged to the rhythm of the earth, to the cycle of sun and shadow, and to the quiet song that lives in birdsong wind, and the distant bark of a morning fox. The path beneath their feet now changed, turning from soft moss to dry stone. And ahead there appeared the first shape of a ruined chapel, its bones of wood and stone rising like fingers, reaching for something long gone, and the traveler stopped at its threshold, where ivy curled around the doorframe and bees had made a home in what was once a bell tower. Now empty, now still, this chapel had not known worship in many years, but still held memory. Like the smell of incense long faded, or the hush that settles after a final hymn was sung, and as the traveler stepped inside, the hollow space offered its silence not in coldness, but in welcome dust moved in shafts of light, and a single wooden bench sat near the altar broken at one end, but still holding shape, and on the altar lay something unexpected. A bundle of lavender tied with simple twine, fresh and fragrant, as if someone had just passed through. Perhaps another outcast or a villager, too kind to be caught in tradition, or perhaps it had grown there between the stones, seeded by a wind long ago. And the traveler reached out their fingers, trembling not from fear but from the weight of such quiet kindness, and touched the lavender, pressing it gently to their chest before sitting slowly on the bench and letting their body rest. And in that rest came memories that rose like birds from tall grass, sudden and silent and soft. And they saw a woman once with hair like chestnut bark, and eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a small cottage with smoke always curling from the chimney, and bread always rising in the corner oven, and children's laughter that spilled across the yard where hens ran in rain barrels. Filled with spring water, they saw the boy who ran barefoot and wild, who carried frogs in his pockets and carved whistles from river reeds. They saw the day it changed, when the mark appeared, when whispers became stares, when fear took root. Where love once bloomed, and then the path away the gate closed, the bell rung, and the long walk into exile. But now, sitting here in this sunlit ruin, the pain softened and the edges blurred, and the sound of bees and leaves made it bearable, and they felt for the first time in so long. Not broken, not cursed, but human, just human. As the day passed, the shadows shifted, and somewhere in the woods, a lute began to play faint and distant and slow, a song that carried no words, just notes rising like smoke from a distant fire, and the traveler listened, letting the sound curl around their mind like warm cloth, and the notes stirred something deep, a story, perhaps one. They had once been told of a bell, not of warning, but of welcome, of a town far beyond the mountains, where no one was turned away, and sickness was met with salves, not fear, and hands were held, not shunned, and in the dream of that place, their eyes closed and their head bowed, and for a while they slept, and in their sleep they dreamed of fields without walls and paths, without endings, and voices calling, not an alarm but an invitation. And when they woke, the light had changed, the warmth deepened, and in the doorway of the chapel stood another figure, tall and still, and wrapped in a brown cloak, with eyes kind and steady. And the traveler rose slowly, not afraid, and the figure held out a cup of water, fresh and cool, and said nothing. And the traveler took it, drank, and nodded, and the figure simply pointed east, then turned and disappeared into the trees without a word. And that was enough, because the traveler understood they were not alone, not entirely, not anymore. And so they stepped from the chapel back into the light, and the lavender remained on the altar, swaying gently as if waving farewell. The path east was narrow and wild-lined with bramble and fern, and birds with bright feathers darted through the air, calling softly as if to guide the way, and the wind carried the scent of something familiar, not bread, not smoke, but something simpler. Clean linen, perhaps, or the salt of distant sea, and every step felt easier, as if the ground itself was helping, lifting, pushing, drawing forward. And soon the sound of water came again, not a stream, but a river, wide and calm, with stepping stones half submerged, and mossy, and across it a meadow opened, full of wild flowers, and beyond the meadow the first low walls of a distant village. No bell, no tower, just rooftops and trees, and the soft blur of life. And the traveler paused, letting the river speak to them in soft bubbles and eddies before stepping carefully across each stone, a breath held with each step. A hope stretched across the current, and when they reached the far bank, they let out that breath and felt something shift. Something inside, something old and aching and long clenched, and it opened like a fist turned palm up. And the sun warmed their face, and their heart beat steady, and for the first time in many years the bell did not echo in their mind. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with bird song and breeze, and footsteps not fleeing, but arriving, and the traveler walked into the meadow, not hidden, not hunched, but upright and slow, like someone returning, not escaping. And the grass bent beneath their feet, and the petals danced, and in the distant village a child laughed, and a dog barked, and a gate creaked, and the world turned as it always does, and the traveler smiled beneath their hood, a soft, small smile that held no bitterness, only release and peace and quiet hope. And they walked on, not toward exile, but toward possibility, toward rest, not as one cursed, but as one healed, or at least healing, in the bell back in the castle. Stayed still, stayed silent, and perhaps would never ring again, not for them, not for anyone, not because the sickness was gone, but because the fear was, and in its place, a different sound had begun to rise, not loud, not sudden, but steady, the sound of voices opening doors, of footsteps, walking paths, once forbidden of hearts, learning again to welcome the stranger and the leper and the lost, because all were part of the same story, all were part of the same dawn. And as the meadow widened and the village neared, the traveler closed their eyes for just a moment and felt the warmth on their skin, and the hush of grass, and the hum of the earth, and they knew they were not forgotten, they were found, they were home. The sun lowered itself gently behind the hills like a weary guest settling into a warm chair, and the village in the distance began to fold inward slowly, houses closing their shutters, lanterns glowing like stars caught in glass, and smoke rising in loose curls from hearths where bread baked and stews simmered in soft songs, hummed from behind doors barely open. And the traveler, now at the edge of the meadow, stood quietly taking in the scene with eyes that had not seen home. In many years, though, this was not the same village they had left, nor the same land. They once knew it was familiar in the way that comfort is familiar. Warm chair, and the village in the distance began to fold inward, slowly houses closing their shutters, lanterns glowing like stars caught in glass and smoke rising and loose. Curls from hearths where bread baked and stews simmered and soft songs hummed from behind doors. Barely open, and the traveler now at the edge of the meadow stood quietly taking in the scene with eyes that had not seen home in many years, though this was not the same village they had left, nor the same land. They once knew it was familiar in the way that comfort is familiar. It's the way fire feels warm, even when it belongs to another. Hearth, and as they stepped forward, their feet brushing against soft wildflowers and dew-wet grass the wind carried. With it, the scent of thyme and rosemary and the faint sweetness of something baking with honey and the traveler's stomach. Stirred, not with hunger, but with memory, the kind of memory that softens the chest and makes the eyes burn gently, not from pain, but from being alive. And as they moved closer, they saw a woman by a fence tending to a small fire pit, her hands wrapped in cloth, her eyes kind, and when she noticed the figure on the path, she did not flinch or turn away, she only stood still and waited, and when the traveler came close enough to speak, they said nothing, and neither did she, for sometimes words are too heavy for moments like these, and the woman simply gestured to a bench beneath an old olive tree. And the traveler sat, the air around them was quiet, but full of insects, humming and branches swaying, and a rooster settling for sleep and in. That hush, the woman brought a bowl of broth, set it down, and walked away, not out of fear, not out of pity, but out of understanding, because there are wounds that are soothed not with questions but with space, and so the traveler sipped the broth, letting the warmth fill them from within and somewhere nearby. A lullaby drifted from a window, a mother singing a child into dreams, and the melody was old, older than stone, older than bells, older than the names we give to fear, and as the final note of the lullaby faded, the traveler looked up and saw a child standing near the fence, her eyes wide but not. Frightened, her hands holding a single white feather, and she stepped forward, just close enough to place it on the grass, then turned and ran into the dusk, her laughter quiet and brief, like a bird taking flight, and the traveler picked up the feather, rolling it gently between fingers that once trembled with shame and now trembled with something softer, and they tucked it into the folds of their cloak and leaned back into the bench, watching the stars emerge one by one like stories waiting to be told, and overhead the moon rose pale and full and gentle like a lantern hung in the sky by a hand too kind to leave the world in darkness, and somewhere far behind in the distance, past the hills and the trees and the river, the old castle stood still in its silence, the bell unmoved, its rusted body swaying slightly in the night breeze, no longer a sentinel of fear, but a relic of what was and what no longer had to be. And in the tower, the watchman sat with his candle low, his ledger, closed his eyes, watching the stars with a look that held no weight, only wonder, and below him, the stone walls of the castle breathed slowly in the night, as if relieved, as if resting after years of tension, and the wind that passed through its halls carried no warning now, only air, only the clean breath of earth and leaf and memory, and far from the castle, the village breathed to the people within, letting go slowly of the stories they'd been told, of the things they feared, of the voices that once said beware, and beginning to hear new stories, softer stories of healing and forgiveness, of second chances, and of the quiet courage it takes to welcome a stranger at dusk and give them a seat and broth and time. And though the traveler spoke to no one that night, their presence left something behind, a softening, a small shift, like mist clearing over water or frost melting from glass, and those who had seen them did not forget the way their steps touched the ground without taking from it, or the way they looked at the world, not with bitterness, but with a patient kind of reverence, as though each stone, each branch, each whisper of wind was a teacher, and long after the traveler rose and continued on deeper into the landscape, others followed, not to chase, but to walk a little more slowly, to look a little more gently, to wonder more often what it might mean to love what we fear, and to sit without answers and listen. And in this way, the traveler became not a warning, but a guide, a myth not of caution, but of compassion, and their path carved through the land, not as exile, but as invitation. And though few ever spoke their name aloud, they were remembered in touches and glances, in the breaking of bread, and the lighting of lanterns, and the careful way. Someone might place a small stone beside the road, just so that someone else might know. They were not walking alone, and in the nights that followed, the wind that once carried the toll of iron now carried softer things, laughter, and flute music, and sometimes even silence, but not the kind of silence that stings, the kind that soothes, the kind that speaks back to all the noise within us and says, "Rest now, you are safe, you are held," and somewhere deep in the hills where moss grows thick and owls nest in trees, an old wooden clapper lies beside a stone, a relic left behind by a hand that no longer needs to ring for safety, because safety has grown roots in the soil itself, and flowers in the field, and fire in the hearths, and hands, and as the traveler walked beneath the moon's kind gaze, each step forward became lighter and lighter, until it seemed they were no longer walking, but floating, carried by the very breath of the earth, toward whatever lay beyond, not feared, not followed, not forgotten, but free. The dawn rose slowly over the edge of the world, its light spilling across hills and rooftops and meadows and golden ribbons that warmed the stones and touched the skin like a blessing, and the traveler, now far from the last village, followed the curve of a narrow path that wound along the side of a gentle hill where wildflowers nodded in morning wind, and rabbits darted between roots of gnarled old trees, and above them a lark sang the first bright notes of a new day, and the air was crisp and clean, and the scent of pine mingled with distant wood smoke, and everything in the world seemed to breathe in at once and hold itself still, as if listening, as if waiting for something small and sacred to arrive. And the traveler moved slowly, their steps quiet, their cloak brushing lightly against tall grass, and their staff tapping rhythmically against the stones beneath, and they were no longer hurried, no longer hunted, no longer held in the shadow of shame, but moved with a calm that came from knowing they had survived, that they had passed through fire and fog and the tolling of bells, and now found themselves in a land where the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the song of wind. And though their hands still bore the marks of illness, and their breath, sometimes, caught with the cold, they felt something had shifted inside, like a locked door finally opened, or a chain finally loosed. And with each step forward, the heaviness of the past fell behind, like old leaves dropping from branches in autumn, and the trees around them seemed to know this too, for they swayed gently, as if bowing in approval, and squirrels paused in their play to watch with bright eyes, and small birds followed for a few heartbeats, fluttering branch to branch before darting away toward the sun. And as the traveler crested the hill, they saw below them a stretch of land that took the breath, not with grandeur, but with stillness, a wide, shallow valley filled with reeds and slow water, and moss-covered stones where deer moved carefully between shadows, and herons lifted into the sky on wings long and silent. And in the middle of this place, where the earth curved like a cradle, stood a low stone dwelling covered in ivy and flowering vine its chimney, breathing soft smoke, its windows open to the morning breeze. And the traveler stopped and stood very still, not because they feared it, but because something in them recognized it, not the place itself, but the feeling it gave, the feeling of somewhere safe and old and waiting. And they descended the path slowly, each footstep carrying 1,000 memories forward, like waves rolling back toward the sea. And when they reached the door, they paused, listening, hearing only the rustle of trees and the quiet bubbling of a nearby spring. And then, with a breath deep and even, they knocked once gently, the sound barely more than a whisper, and from within came the slow creak of wood, and the door opened, and in its frame stood an old man, his face lined and his eyes sharp and clear, like polished stone. And he looked at the traveler for a long moment, and said nothing, and the traveler said nothing too. And then the old man stepped aside and nodded once, slow and silent, and the traveler entered, and the room inside was warm and filled with light and the smell of herbs and something sweet baking in a clay oven, and shelves lined the walls filled with jars and bundles of dried plants, and old scrolls and feathers and stones smoothed by time. And the air carried the kind of stillness that only comes with wisdom and long waiting. And the traveler sat at a small stool near the fire, and the old man brought a bowl of something warm and fragrant and placed it before them. and then he sat two across the room. Not speaking, not staring, simply present, and the fire cracked softly between them, and the wind passed over the chimney with a sigh, and time seemed to pause. As if honoring the moment, and slowly the traveler began to eat their spoon, moving with care, their hands steady and quiet. And the old man watched and waited, and finally spoke, his voice like worn cloth, like a stream over gravel, and he said, "You have come far?" And the traveler nodded once, and the old man said, "You carry silence like a cloak?" And the traveler nodded again. And the old man asked not your name, but your story. And the traveler looked into the fire, and saw not flame but memory. The flicker of faces long gone, and nights spent beneath trees, and paths taken through storms and songs, hummed to soothe fear, and they spoke slowly, softly, each word like a stone placed upon the ground, not to build a wall but a path. And the old man listened, his hands folded, his eyes unmoving, and when the traveler finished, they both sat without words, letting the fire speak, letting the story settle into the walls and the beams and the floor, and outside the valley continued to move in its quiet rhythm. The water gliding, the birds calling, the sun shifting across the sky like a slow turning page. And the old man rose and placed a hand on the traveler's shoulder and said, "This house is not a place to stay, but a place to remember. You are not your exile, you are not your wounds. You are the one who walked and still walks and still breathes and still sings, even if no one hears." And the traveler closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to hold the moment, to press it into memory like a petal between pages. And when they opened them, again the old man was already by the shelves, gathering a small bundle of herbs and cloth and flint, and he placed it in the traveler's hand and said, "The road does not end, but it does bend, and you are ready for what lies around it." And the traveler rose, bowing their head, and stepped into the morning once more, the sun now higher, the birds louder, the wind warmer, and each step forward felt like the beginning of something not grand, not loud, but real. And they walked with a heart no longer heavy, and hands no longer clenched. And as they moved through the valley, the animals did not run, the leaves did not hide, and even the stones beneath their feet felt soft, and the path ahead curved gently to the right, disappearing into a stand of birches. And the traveler followed, their cloak fluttering behind them like a story still being written, and somewhere far away back on a hill the castle stood, but no longer as a place of warning or exile. Instead, it was simply old and still and quiet, its bell forgotten by all but a few, and maybe one day ivy would claim its stones, and owls would nest in its towers, and children would climb its walls, not to run from sickness, but to feel the sky. And maybe one day someone would find the old bell and ring it, not in fear but in celebration, and maybe the sound would drift over the hills like music, and those who heard it would not hide but would smile, not knowing why, only feeling a soft warmth in their chest, like remembering a dream or a voice long lost. And for now the traveler walked the path ahead, welcoming each sound, each shadow, step as a friend, not because the world had changed completely, but because they had, and that was enough. The path curved gently through the birch grove, where pale trunks stood like sentinels in a temple of silence, and the air grew cooler, touched with the scent of damp bark and wild mint. Crushed beneath the slow tread of the traveler's feet, and sunlight slipped through the leaves in golden threads that stitched the forest floor into a quilt of soft brightness and living shadow. And every few steps a breeze would pass through the branches above and stir them with a whisper like pages turning in an unseen book. And the traveler moved steadily with the rhythm of the trees, their breath deep and slow, their eyes half-lidded, as if lulled by the hush that wrapped the world in a cocoon of rest. And the wind carried faint sounds of distant water, the gentle rush of a stream or a narrow river gliding between stones and roots. And somewhere far off, perhaps just beyond the next rise, a woodpecker tapped in a lullaby rhythm, soft and steady, like a heart at peace. And the traveler's cloak brushed against fern and foxglove, and the occasional dry stick that cracked beneath their heel with a sound so small it was instantly swallowed by the forest's great hush. And as they passed beneath an arching limb, where moss hung like silken threads, the traveler paused and tilted their head upward, letting the dappled light paint their face in fragments of sun and sky. And their thoughts drifted not as worries or sharp memories, but as gentle images a woman's hand pressing a coin into their palm, a dog sleeping with one ear twitching by a cottage. Fire a lullaby hummed on a summer evening, and they let these thoughts pass like clouds over a still lake, not clinging to any of them, just watching them float and fade. And as they turned again to the path ahead, they noticed a stone nestled in the roots of an old tree carved with a circle and 3 lines, the mark of a healer, a guide, or perhaps a fellow traveler long gone, and they knelt before it, running their fingers over its worn surface, feeling the grooves worn deep with time and rain. They placed a single sprig of herb upon it, not as an offering, but as a hello, and then rose and continued on their way, the land rising now into a soft ridge, where the trees thinned and the light grew stronger, and as they reached the crest they saw stretched out before them a wide plain golden with tall grass swaying in slow waves, and at its far edge, nestled beside a curve of river, sat a cluster of stone cottages, smoke curling lazily from chimneys and goats moving in a crooked line toward a low barn. And the travelers stood still for a while, letting the wind comb through their hair and the light touch their skin. And for a long time they simply breathed, breathing in peace and out memory, breathing in light and out fear. And when at last they stepped forward, it was with a stride that felt less like walking and more like returning. And as they made their way across the field, bees drifted near, dipping between flowers that opened their petals to the sun, and dragonflies buzzed past in quiet zigzags of blue and green, and the scent of the river reached them cool and soft with the touch of silt and stone. And when they reached the first low wall that marked the edge of the village, no one called out, no. One cried alarm, for the bell in this place had long ago been taken down and melted into plowshares and kettles. And no one feared the ring of metal anymore. And so the traveler entered in silence and calm. Their presence felt, but not questioned, and the first to see them was a boy no more than 7, who stood with a small net beside a rain barrel trying to scoop frogs, and when he saw the traveler, he tilted his head as if sensing something not dangerous, not strange, just different, and then returned to his game. And the traveler passed him with a soft nod and a faint smile, and soon others appeared from behind doors and around corners, not many. A dozen perhaps in total, all pausing to see and feel and sense this arrival, and none turned away, none shouted, none stepped forward. Either they only watched, and the traveler walked among them with the quiet of wind and wheat moving without rush, without hesitation, until they came to the well in the center of the village, where an old woman stood lowering a bucket. And when she looked up, her eyes held stories more than questions, and she said without fear, "Are you hungry?" And the traveler answered yes, in a voice cracked with wind and time. She said, "Then come and eat," and turned without looking back, and the traveler followed her into a cottage, where the ceiling was low, and the shelves were lined with jars, and cloth and bread rose on the hearth, and soup simmered in a clay pot, and she handed them a bowl and a cup, and they sat without ceremony near the warmth of the fire. And for a while they said nothing, just the soft clink of spoon to bowl the rhythm of breath and chew and swallow, and the scent of thyme and root and barley, filling the air like a balm. And when the bowl was empty, the traveler set it down with hands that no longer shook, and the woman handed them damp cloth, and they wiped their face slowly, and for the first time in years they felt clean, not just on the skin, but beneath it. And the woman nodded as if confirming something unspoken, and said, "You can stay the night," and left them there to rest. And they did not weep, but they might have if they had had the strength for it. Instead, they sat near the fire and let it warm their bones and dry the damp corners of their soul, and outside the village moved with the soft rhythms of evening, a child calling for their cat, a gate creaking in the breeze, a man stacking kindling near his door. And above all of it, the sky deepened into dusk, the first star trembling into view, and the traveler rose and stepped out once more into the night, which wrapped around them like a soft blanket, and they stood in the center of the village and looked to the sky, and then to the dark shapes of the hills beyond, and felt no pull to move, no itch in the feet, no fear at the edges of thought, only rest, only stillness, only the deep and gentle hush of belonging, and somewhere far behind them in the distant fog of memory, a bell hung in a tower, long, silent, and unmoving. And as the traveler looked up into the face of the moon, they no longer heard it, not even in dream, not even in fear. They heard instead the sound of a place that needed no warning, no casting out, no exile, a place where silence meant safety, where open doors replaced drawn bolts, and where names were spoken without shame and hands were held without question. And the traveler closed their eyes and breathed that sound into their lungs and let it settle in their bones, and knew that whatever path came next, it would no longer be walked in solitude or shadow, but in light and in welcome. The night settled gently over the village like a velvet curtain drawn with care, as stars unfolded across the sky in delicate patterns. It's known best to sailors and shepherds and those who walked the land by instinct and memory. And the traveler, now lying upon a straw mattress near the hearth, listened to the soft murmur of logs cracking in the fire and the quiet, rhythmic breath of sleep from somewhere. In the next room and outside, the world hushed itself in preparation for dreaming. The trees stood still, the wind curled itself into pockets between stone walls, and the animals in the barn settled into their warm corners, as if the whole world understood the deep sacred stillness of night. And the traveler did not sleep at first. Instead, they lay with their hands resting gently upon their chest, their eyes half closed, their body fully still, as they let the calm sink deeper into their bones, into their muscles, into the quiet corners of the soul where fear once lived. And in that warmth, they remembered not with pain but with gentleness. They remembered the early days the first time. Their reflection changed the silence that followed the separation. The echo of doors closing behind them, the bell ringing not as a note but as a sentence, and yet somehow in this warm, quiet place, those sounds no longer echoed. They had softened, as all sharp sounds do with time and memory, and now they were like mist in the distance, barely. They are part of the story, but no longer the whole. And the traveler let that shift happen without grasping. Let it rise and fall like breath, and finally at last their eyes closed and they slept. And in their dreams there were no walls, no bells, no exile, only paths of soft moss and hands, reaching without fear in the hush of trees, in the hush of waters, in the hush of peace. And when morning came, it came gently, as it always does. The light entered slowly through the small window by the hearth, casting long yellow lines across the packed dirt floor, and the traveler stirred not with alarm, but with the slow and easy rhythm of someone who has slept deeply and well. And they sat up, wrapped in their cloak, and stretched and breathed. And when they stepped outside, the village was already awake with quiet movement, a woman hanging clothes on a line, a man drawing water from the well, a child chasing a hen with more joy than success. And the traveler stood watching all of it, feeling no need to move or speak, simply letting the moment be whole and full and unbroken. And then the old woman from the night before appeared with a wooden cup of warm milk and a smile that needed no words, and the traveler accepted it with a soft bow of the head and drank it slowly, savoring the warmth. And then they walked to the edge of the village, where the path continued beyond a row of old oak trees, and stood there looking out over the land that rolled out before them, like a great open map, marked not by ink but by memory and light and promise. And they could feel something stirring in their chests, not a call exactly, but a gentle suggestion, as if the road itself whispered, "You may go if you wish, or you may stay." And they turned once to look at the village behind them. The way the light touched the rooftops, the scent of fresh bread drifting from a chimney, the sound of a flute played softly by unseen hands, and for a moment they considered staying, truly staying. But something within them still moved, still reached, and so with a breath that carried both gratitude and goodbye, they stepped forward again. The path beneath them, welcoming the trees overhead, swaying in rhythm with their steps, and the birds calling above like old friends waving from branches. And as the traveler moved on, the village did not forget them, nor did it close its gates. Instead, its people watched until the cloak was just a blur against the horizon, and then they returned to their mourning, each one carrying something of the traveler within them. A way of walking, a way of listening, a way of letting the world be softer. And the traveler walked now not as one banished, but as one blessed their presence. Quiet harmony with the land around them, and as the day warmed, the road began to change, winding into thicker woods, where mushrooms grew in hidden patches, and foxes slipped silently between roots, and the air was thick with green and gold, and the scent of pine needles and loam. And the traveler followed the winding trail without map or fear, trusting the old wisdom of the trees and their own well-worn instincts. and before long they came upon a stream not wide, but swift the water singing as it moved over stone and fallen leaves, and there they stopped to kneel and drink and wash their hands and face. And in the reflection that rippled back, they saw not disease or burden, but the face of a survivor, marked but steady-aged, but whole. And they smiled softly at that reflection, letting it shimmer and dance, and then rose again to walk and further down the stream. The trees began to thin, and the land opened once more, revealing a meadow bright with color, where bees hummed low over blooming clover, and butterflies danced through the air as if the world itself was dreaming. And at the far end of the meadow stood a tree unlike any other, wide and old, and wrapped in hanging moss, and near its base a circle of stones carefully placed as if in ritual or remembrance, and the traveler approached with quiet steps, sensing the weight of the space, the hush of memory. And when they reached the circle they saw, it was filled with tokens, a length of ribbon, a smooth glass bead, a carving of a bird, and in the center a bell no bigger than a cupped hand resting upon the largest stone, and it was not rusted or broken, but polished and clean, and beside it a note in simple letters that read, "Ring this, not in fear, but in thanks." And the traveler reached out slowly and took the bell in their hands and held it for a long moment, letting the warmth of the sun soak into the metal, and then with a breath they rang at once, soft and clear, and the sound moved out across the meadow like a ripple across still water. And it was not mournful or cold, but bright and calm, and full of something like light. And the traveler placed it back on the stone and sat beside the circle for a while, listening not to the bell, but to the silence. It left behind a silence filled with birds and bees and wind, and the soft inner voice that had once been drowned out by fear and exile, but now spoke clearly and gently, "You are well. You are worthy. You are whole." And when the traveler stood to walk again, they did so with no destination, only direction, letting the road unfold like ribbon, letting the wind decide where it turned, and letting the world around them be. It's not something to fear, but something to feel. And as the trees rose again to meet them, and the sky shifted into soft evening shades, the traveler did not look back, for nothing was lost, only changed, only softened, only understood. And they walked on into the golden hush of the world, not to escape, but to be. The traveler moved through the deepening trees, where dusk gathered in blue shadows, and the underbrush grew thick with fern and creeping vine, and the air cooled as the sun slid down behind the hills, casting the forest in a soft twilight hush. And their steps slowed not from weariness, but from reverence, as if each footfall was part of an ancient rhythm. And the forest, a cathedral built from bark and leaf and sky. And as they walked deeper, the sound of birdsong gave way to the rustling of nocturnal life, a fox slipping between roots, a deer lifting its head among the reeds, and the distant hoot of an owl calling through the canopy like a bell without clamor. And the traveler paused near a fallen log and ran their fingers over its mossy curve, feeling the spongy softness, the life growing from decay. And they let themselves sit back upon the cool earth, resting their back against the trunk of a tree, and listened to the stillness that was never truly silent, only layered with delicate sounds, the language of night speaking in gentle tones. And the stars above began to pierce the deepening sky, one by one, like watchful eyes, opening slowly and without hurry. And the traveler closed their own eyes for a time, not to sleep, but to breathe in rhythm the world around them, to match the pulse of the earth, the slow, steady heartbeat of the old land that had always known suffering and healing, exile and return. And when they opened their eyes again, it was full night, and the path ahead glowed faintly with moonlight trickling down between the trees, casting silver light like breadcrumbs leading forward. And they stood once more, wrapping their cloak tightly, and stepped along the trail that curved like a stream flowing toward something unseen. And for hours, or perhaps minutes or lifetimes, they walked without a thought of time, their mind quiet, their limbs light, their heart no longer armored, but open, soft as the dark sky. And they came upon a small wooden bridge spanning narrow stream, and in the middle of the bridge sat a lantern, unlit but full of oil, with a flint resting beside it. And the traveler struck the flint once, twice, 3 times, until a soft flame caught and filled the lantern with a warm glow that painted the wood in gold and their face in amber. And as they crossed the bridge, the sound of water, beneath whispered stories in a language older than word, stories of those who came before and those who would follow, of paths walked and paths waiting to be found. And on the far side of the bridge, the trail opened again into a clearing where stones had been arranged in a wide spiral, and in the center, a fire pit waited, cold and clean, and nearby a small bench carved from an old cedar log with a wool blanket folded neatly upon it. And the traveler laid the lantern upon the bench and lit the fire with care, coaxing the flame until it danced brightly, sending up sparks like tiny stars, and the warmth reached outward, slowly touching their skin and seeping into their bones. And they wrapped the blanket around their shoulders and sat watching the fire burn low and steady. And they felt no urgency, no purpose beyond presence, and let their thoughts drift, not like burdens, but like feathers rising and falling on unseen air. And they thought of faces, once feared, now softened by time and distance, and of words once bitter, now quiet and forgotten, and of the bell that had once followed them through every doorway, every glance, every silence, that now existed only in memory, only in stories, only in the past. And they breathed in the cool scent of pine smoke and wood and earth. And as the fire crackled softly and the trees swayed above them, they felt a great stillness within a stillness that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace, with the knowledge that they were no longer running, no longer hiding, only being. And when at last they laid down upon the earth, the blanket pulled up to their chin and the fire glowing low beside them, they fell into sleep, not from exhaustion, but from release. And in their dreams, they saw the forest walking to trees, swaying with slow, intent branches, lowering in greeting in the stream, whispering lullabies in tones only dreamers could hear in the stars, above humming a song of return and rest. And when they woke again, the fire had cooled 2 embers, and birds had begun to stir in the branches, and the sky had shifted into the lavender of early morning, and the traveler rose with no stiffness, no pain, only softness in their limbs and breath. And they stepped once more along the trail that led beyond the clearing into the highlands, where fog rolled low across the hills, and the stones were smooth with age and story. And in the distance they heard bells, not warning, not mourning, but celebration, a small village, perhaps a market day, perhaps a festival. And they did not fear the sound, for it did not call them out, it welcomed them in. And they smiled and followed it, the path rising with each step until the land spread wide and bright before them in the village. Below came into view roofs of thatch and slate chimneys, breathing pale smoke, narrow lanes, curled like ribbon around homes and gardens, and at its center a tall stone tower with ivy climbing its base and bells, strung from its high windows, not for alarm, but for song. And as the traveler descended the final slope, the wind carried laughter and the smell of roasted apples and something like cinnamon, and their steps quickened slightly, not from haste, but from joy, from the sense of movement that meant welcome. And when they reached the first cottage, a child waved from the fence, and a woman smiled without suspicion, and a dog trotted near and sniffed and then licked their hand, and the traveler knelt to greet it with a gentle touch and a quiet thank you. And further in they passed a baker placing loaves upon a windowsill, and a smith hammering with rhythm more musical than laborious. And each person looked not with question, but with kindness. And the bell above the square rang once, then twice, its tone rich and round, like a voice long unafraid to speak. And the traveler stood beneath it and listened to the notes spill out over rooftops and trees, not a warning, not a curse, just sound pure and full and free. And they stepped into the square where a table had been set, with bowls of stew and bread and chairs left empty, not forgotten, but ready. And someone gestured welcome, and someone poured a cup, and someone offered a scarf. As the wind began to rise, and the traveler sat and accepted and ate and drank and felt the warmth of belonging, not as a gift given, but as something always waiting, always ready. And around them the village moved with the soft rhythm of contentment, voices low and smiling hands busy with quiet labor, children weaving through the crowd like birds in flight. And above it all, the bell rang again, softer this time, like a memory made real. And the traveler lifted their eyes and saw in the tower's window a plaque carved in wood and gold that read, "Once used to divide, now rung to unite," and they closed their eyes for a moment and let the sound wash over them. Not as exile, not as judgment, but as music, and when they opened their eyes, again they no longer felt the weight of the past, not as something to forget, but as something transformed. Made light, made soft, made part of the greater story, and they rose and walked among the people, not separate, not feared, not questioned, only known. Silence and everything to do with peace with the knowledge that they were no longer running, no longer hiding, only being. And when at last they laid down upon the earth, blanket pulled up to their chin, and the fire glowing low beside them, they fell into sleep. Not from exhaustion, but from release, and in their dreams they saw the forest walking to trees, swaying with slow intent branches lowering in greeting, and the stream whispering lullabies and tones only dreamers could hear, and the stars above humming a song of return and rest. And when they woke again, the fire had cooled 2 embers, and birds had begun to stir in the branches, and the sky had shifted into the lavender of early morning, and the traveler rose with no stiffness, no pain, only softness in their limbs and breath. And they stepped once more along the trail that led beyond the clearing into the highlands, where fog rolled low across the hills, and the stones were smooth with age and story, and in the distance they heard bells not warning, not mourning, but celebration, a small village. Perhaps a market day, perhaps a festival, and they did not fear the sound, for it did not call them out, it welcomed them in. And they smiled and followed it, the path rising with each step, until the land spread wide and bright before them, and the village. Below came into view roofs of thatch and slate chimneys, breathing pale smoke, narrow lanes curled like ribbon around homes, and gardens, and at its center, a tall stone tower with ivy climbing its base and bells strung from its high. Windows not for alarm, but for song, and as the traveler descended the final slope, the wind carried laughter and the smell of roasted apples and something like cinnamon in there. Steps quickened slightly, not from haste, but from joy, from the sense of movement that meant welcome, and when they reached the first cottage, a child waved from the fence, and a woman smiled without suspicion, and a dog trotted near and sniffed, and then licked their hand, and the traveler knelt to greet it with a gentle touch and a quiet thank you, and further in, they passed a baker placing loaves upon a windowsill, and a smith hammering with rhythm more musical than laborious in each person, looked not with question, but with kindness, and the bell above. The square rang once, then twice, its tone rich and round like a voice long unafraid to speak, and the traveler stood beneath it and listened to the notes spill out over rooftops and trees, not a warning, not a curse, just sound pure and full and free, and they stepped into the square, where a table had been set with bowls of stew and bread, and chairs left empty. Not forgotten, but ready, and someone gestured welcome, and someone poured a cup, and someone offered a scarf as the wind began to rise, and the traveler sat and accepted and ate, and drank and felt the warmth of belonging, not as a gift given, but as something always waiting, always ready. And around them the village moved with the soft rhythm of contentment, voices low and smiling hands, busy with quiet labor, children weaving through the crowd like birds in flight, and above it all, the bell rang again, softer this time, like a memory made real, and the traveler lifted their eyes, and saw in the tower's window a plaque carved in wood and gold that read, "Once used to divide, rung to unite," and they closed their eyes for a moment, and let the sound wash over them. They no longer felt the weight of the past, not as something to forget, but as something transformed. Made light, made soft, made part of the greater story, and they rose and walked among the people, not separate. Not feared, not questioned, only known. The sky above the village shimmered with the soft light of early evening, not quite gold, not quite gray, but somewhere in between, a color that felt like a lullaby humming gently across the rooftops, and the travelers stood in the village, square with a cup of warm cider between their hands, watching as lanterns were lit. One, by careful hands, holding long poles with flames at the tip, and each light that flickered to life seemed to melt into the next, casting a honey glow. Across stone paths and wooden doors and garden fences, and the villagers moved slowly now, as if the whole town had exhaled at once, slipping into the hush of twilight, where voices were lower, and footsteps quieter, and the world leaned in to listen, and the traveler moved with them. No longer apart from the rhythm, but inside it, part of the gentle choreography of life returning to itself. And as they walked past the blacksmith's shop, they saw the man now wiping his hands, with a cloth, smiling slightly as he leaned against his doorway and watched his daughter chase fireflies barefoot through the grass, her giggle like the ring of a very different kind of bell. And near the baker's window, the scent of cloves and bread and warm fruit drifted into the lane, making the traveler's stomach stir gently, with memory and hunger, and someone from within handed them a small tart on a folded napkin. Without a word, just a nod, and the traveler accepted it, slowly savoring the sweetness that crumbled across their tongue and lingered. They're like sunlight through branches, and when they reached the edge of the square, where the cobblestone path turned to packed earth once more, they paused, looking back at the scene behind them, the glow, the movement, the ease of it all, and they understood something quiet but powerful, that peace was not the absence of past sorrow, but the presence of present kindness. And as they stood, a hand brushed theirs, and a voice low and musical said, "You could stay." And the traveler turned and saw an old man with soft eyes and a walking stick carved with spiral shapes, and he tilted his head gently and added, "Or you could come with me to the High Bell if you like." And the traveler nodded, not out of obligation, but because they were ready and together. They walked beyond the village, past the last row of cottages, into the hills where grass grew long and wind moved in. Waves like water, and the sky above darkened further into that velvet shade of deepening night, where stars began to gather like fireflies of the heavens, and ahead stood the High Bell. Not part of a tower, not framed by stone, but suspended between two tall wooden beams, wrapped in ivy and strung with small bones and feathers and ribbons and shells. And beneath it, a circle of stones smoothed by time and footsteps. And when they arrived, the old man sat upon a flat rock and gestured for the traveler to sit beside him, and they did, letting the wind move through their hair, and the quiet settled between them like a blanket. And after a long moment, the old man spoke, his voice low and steady, saying, "When the bell rang in warning, it cast people out. But now when we ring it, it calls them home." And he reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small mallet wrapped in silk and handed it to the traveler, and nodded once, and the traveler stood moving slowly into the center of the ring and looked up at the bell. It was not ornate. It bore no crest or mark of kingdom, only the patina of weather and wind and time. And the traveler closed their eyes and lifted the mallet and rang the bell once, just once, and the sound that rose was not harsh, not loud, not fearful. It was round and full and soft, like a song held in the chest of someone who has waited too long to sing. And the sound rolled over the hills, into the valleys back, toward the village, and out across the land. And for a long while nothing moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause to listen. And then from the far edges of the land there came a reply. Not a bell, not a word, but a feeling like 1,000 quiet yeses, rising from the hearts of people, long silent. And in that moment the traveler felt something within them soften, break open, and mend all at once. And when they opened their eyes again, stars had multiplied, and the old man was smiling, and he said softly, "You are not alone." And you never were. And they sat together in the starlight, letting the quiet take them like a river, slow and deep and ancient, And when they returned to the village, the traveler felt no need to move. On the next morning, they awoke to birdsong and warm light and the scent of wild mint in the air, and they helped carry bread to the square and fetch water from the well and repair a fence. And when someone fell ill, they sat beside them and read from a tattered book in a soft, even voice until the fever passed and the bell above. The village rang not in fear, but in joy, in unity, in remembrance, and each time it rang, the traveler smiled, quietly knowing that their journey had not ended, but only changed shape. And so they lived among the people of the village, not as other, not as stranger, but as one of them. They planted gardens, and taught songs, and sat with the grieving, and told stories of the forest and the meadow and the spiral of stones. And each evening, when the sky turned lavender and then violet, they lit the lanterns in one night. Many moons later, they walked once more to the high bell, not alone, but with the village children following behind with laughter and wide eyes, and they showed them how to hold the mallet and listen for the right moment. And one by one the children took turns ringing the bell, each note rising like a prayer, like a promise, like the sound of a world learning to welcome itself. And in time, the traveler grew older and their steps slower, but their heart lighter, and one morning they sat beneath the avirapt beams of the high bell and watched the mist roll in across the valley, and they closed their eyes and breathed it in and smiled. And when they did not wake, again the village rang the bell once, not in sorrow, not in parting, but in love, and that sound moved across the hills and into the trees and over the old paths. Once walked in silence and fear, now held in song and light and memory, and somewhere far away, in another town, someone heard that sound and looked toward the hills and felt something they could not name, but understood, and they began to walk. And so the story never ended, only continued, each footstep, a sentence, each bell, a chapter, each voice, a line in the great soft book of the world. And when the wind moves through the trees and the leaves rustle like breath and the stars flicker in, the dark and the fire crackles low in the hearth somewhere beneath. The hush of it all, you can still hear it faint and far away, but real, the sound of the leper bell ringing, not as exile but as invitation, not as sorrow but as lullaby. And in that sound you are welcome, and in that welcome you may rest. The seasons passed gently across the village like a painter brushing the world with slow, careful strokes, and the traveler, now called by name, that title, lived quietly among the people who no longer remembered the bell as dark beginnings, but only its present beauty and the way its tone marked time, like the sun moving overhead, or the moon tracing its silver arc. And in spring, the meadows around the village burst into color with buttercups and bluebells, swaying in the breeze, and the traveler would walk those fields with children who wore crowns of dandelions and chased butterflies as if they were catching dreams. And in summer, the river beyond the wood grew full and warm enough for bathing, and the traveler would sit beneath the willow tree, reading stories to those too young to swim and sharing quiet glances with those who came just to listen to the sound of their voice. And in autumn the hills turned amber and rust, and the villagers gathered apples in woven baskets and pressed cider in the square, and the traveler helped decorate the festival pole with ribbons that danced in the wind, and lanterns shaped like stars that glowed even after the sun had gone. And in winter, when the snow came soft and deep, the bell rang slow and low, and the traveler sat beside the hearth in the long hall, where everyone gathered, sharing tales by firelight, their voice soft, and even with pauses long enough to hear the wood pop and the wind sing at the shutters. And in those stories were fragments of truth braided with wonder, the story of the misty hill where the bell once warned. Instead of welcomed, the story of the bridge where lanterns waited, unlit, the story of the bones that marked the forgotten path, and the old tower swallowed by ivy and shadow. And yet no fear came with those tales, only calm understanding and quiet awe, as if the past was not a wound but a root in the traveler. This voice, like the bell, no longer rang with alarm, but with peace. And each child who heard their stories grew up with a memory not of fear, but of light, and one such child, named Rowan, grew into a thoughtful youth with eyes that saw not just what was, but what could be. And one day as snow melted and the first crocuses bloomed, they approached the traveler, who now walked slower but still steady, and asked with a whisper, almost afraid to disturb, "The quiet will you teach me?" And the traveler smiled. without hesitation, took their hand and said gently, "I already am." And so Rowan followed them from task to task, learning. It's not just how to plant, or heal, or sing, but how to listen, how to notice the way. A shadow bent when someone was afraid, or how silence changed when someone needed to speak, and how the bell's song could change with the touch of wind, or the tone of hope. And together they walked off into the high bell, carrying bread or herbs, or simply silence, and sat beneath its wooden arms, watching the clouds drift like ships across the sky. And over time, others joined them, not to be taught, but to be near the calm, the ease, the warmth that followed the traveler wherever they stepped. And in time, those who had once feared the past began to ask about it gently, with reverence and not resistance, and the traveler would tell them not to shame, not to scold, but to share stories like seeds planted softly in the heart. And Rowan would listen, always quiet, always thoughtful, learning the rhythm of remembrance and healing. And when the traveler at last grew too tired to walk the hills, Rowan helped them to the bench near the bell, and held their hand as they rested their head against the old oak that had watched over them for years. And there beneath that tree, where wind and memory entwined, the traveler closed their eyes one final time, and the bell rang, not in grief, but in gratitude, and its sound rolled gently down the hill through the forest, and into the hearts of all who heard it. And though their voice was gone, their stories remained carried in the voices of others, and in Rowan, who took up their place not as a mirror, but as a new melody, shaped by love and patience and presence. And now, when the wind stirs and the leaves murmur and the fire hums low, those who gather in the long hall still speak the traveler's name and ring the bell with care, and tell stories of the one who turns sorrow into song and fear into home. And though the world beyond the village remains wide and uncertain, and sometimes still cruel, there is always that hill, always that bell, and always someone who remembers how to listen, how to welcome, how to love, without fear. And somewhere, far from the village, on a road not marked by maps, a child walks alone, feet sore, eyes wide, heart heavy, and ahead they hear a sound not loud but full, a note held long and soft like breath, and they follow it. Over the hills, into the trees, across the quiet stones, and the lantern waits already lit. And when they arrive, someone opens their arms and says softly, "Welcome home." The bell's gentle song continued to drift across the hills, through morning mists and midnight hush, through the long days of planting and the slow nights of stars. And even though the traveler had long passed into the hush beyond the world, their presence remained in the way. People moved in the way they spoke, and the way they waited to listen before answering. And among the stones of the old path, where moss grew thick and soft, and where once only the exiled dared walk, now children ran laughing barefoot, while elders watched with warm eyes. And the wind no longer carried the sting of silence, but the calm of belonging. And Rowan, now grown with strands of silver near the temples, and voice grown steady like river water, guided the bell's keeping with a quiet strength born not of command but of invitation. In each season they walked the hills, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, placing a small token. Here a smooth stone, there a braid of grass, or a folded ribbon, and these became offerings, not to ward off danger, but to thank the land for memory, and the past for its lessons. And the bell above still swayed in the wind, though it was now held by stronger beams, carved with stories and etched with names, not just of the traveler, but of all who had come and gone, who had stayed or healed or grown. And Rowan would often sit beneath the bell during twilight, when the sky deepened into that soft indigo that held both ending and beginning. They would close their eyes and breathe and feel the presence of everything and everyone who had come before. And on one such evening, a soft footstep approached, and a young girl with eyes like dusk sat beside them and asked in a whisper, "Where do the stories go when no one tells them?" And Rowan smiled gently and replied, "They wait." And the girl asked, "Do they wait forever?" And Rowan answered, "Only until someone like you listens." And so the girl began to ask questions, and Rowan began to tell, and the stories stirred again like leaves in the wind, soft rising truths that had waited so long for a voice, and now found one. And the people of the village continued to gather in the long hall, with walls now covered in weavings and drawings and little carved tokens, each one a memory made visible. And on cool nights, when the stars blinked above like ancient fires, the bell would ring once low and warm, and someone would begin a tale, and another would add to it. and another still, until the story took shape like smoke curling into a form, and when it ended, there would be silence, not awkward, but sacred, the space where meaning settles and sleep begins, and far beyond the village and towns. Still learning how to be soft, there were whispers of a place where the bell did not send people away but called them close, and slowly, quietly people began to follow those whispers' feet on old stones. Hands brushing the bark of trees' eyes, lifting to the high hill where the bell lived, and those who arrived weary or afraid found not questions but tea and blankets, and warmth in a hand held gently, and over time some stayed and some continued their journey, but all carried the sound of the bell with them. A memory, a note, a promise that they were never truly alone, and one day as clouds rolled low across the sky and rain tapped gently against the windows, Rowan stood before the bell and saw, in the distance, a group approaching led by a woman whose face was lined by wind and wisdom, and behind her came others. Some young, some old, some limping, some dancing, all holding small bundles wrapped in cloth, and when they arrived, the woman stepped forward and unwrapped her bundle, revealing a tiny bell carved of wood and strung on a cord, and she said softly, "This was my mother, Ez." And she said she heard a sound once that changed everything, and I think this is the place she meant, and Rowan reached out and took the bell holding it, as if it were made of snow, and nodded and said, "Then this is where it belongs," and they tied it gently to the great bell. S-frame, and when the wind blew, it rang not loud, not sharp, but like a heartbeat, and everyone gathered around not to celebrate, but to breathe together, and as the rain fell, the fire inside the hall crackled, and a story began, not an old one, not a remembered one, but one born in that very moment, made of new voices and shared eyes and the warmth of being seen, and the girl who once asked about forgotten stories now sat near the front, her hands folded, her gaze steady, and when Rowan paused, she picked up where they left off, not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly, and the bell rang again, this time without being touched, moved only by the wind and somewhere beyond the hills. Someone paused in their step and looked up and felt something stirred deep within, like a memory not theirs but meant for them all the same, and they smiled and walked on. The seasons turned again and again, not in haste, but in harmony, and the village by the hill grew gently like a garden left to bloom. On its own terms, and with each turning, came new faces, some who stayed for only a night, and others who found in the ringing of the bell something they had searched for all their lives, something that could not be touched, but only felt a resonance that hummed just beneath the surface of everything, a reminder that they were not lost. And one such person was a boy named Eli, who arrived one frostbitten evening with no shoes and eyes that carried too many winters. And when he first heard the bell, it was not from the hill, but from a necklace worn by the baker. His daughter, a small copper charm that jingled softly when she turned her head, and it stopped him in his tracks, as if someone had spoken his name, and before he even knew the way to the hearth, or the name of the village, he was wrapped in warmth and led inside and fed until the shaking stopped, and the baker, asked daughter whose name was. May sat beside him and said nothing at all, and it was the quiet that healed him. First, not the food or the fire, but the silence that allowed him to breathe without fear, and in the days that followed, Eli wandered the village slowly, his hands always folded behind his back, as if holding something he could not yet give. And he did not speak, not because he would not, but because he did not know what should be said, and the people did not press him, they only nodded and offered him small things, a fresh roll, a clean shirt, a scarf the color of twilight, and in return he began to do small things as well, stacking firewood, sweeping steps, refilling lanterns without being asked, and the village understood that this too was speaking. And when at last Eli climbed the hill and stood beneath the bell, he looked up into its shadow and placed his hand on the wood and whispered, "Thank you," and though the bell did not ring, something shifted in the air like a sigh or a nod or a heartbeat, felt not heard, and from that day Eli was never far from the hill, often found with a book or a sketch pad, or simply lying back in the grass watching the clouds drift like stories not yet written. And it was there that Rohan found him one evening, the sky painted in gold and coral, and Rowan sat beside him and said softly, "It's a good place to think." And Eli smiled and replied, "It's the only place. I've found where I don't have to." And Rowan laughed, the quiet kind of laugh that feels like a blanket being tucked around your shoulders, and said that. "That's why it's special." And so the two began to share that space, not in constant talk, but in presence and over time. Eli began to ask questions, not many, just enough, and Rowan answered not as a teacher, but as a fellow traveler, someone who knew the terrain of silence, and the landscape of healing. And as winter crept in and the winds grew sharp, Eli took it upon himself to repair the lanterns along the path leading up the hill, carefully cleaning the glass, trimming the wicks, refilling the oil, and lighting each one before dusk. And by midwinter, the path glowed like a ribbon of stars, leading the way not just for feet, but for hearts unsure of their steps. And people began to notice how calm the walk became, how even those who came with heavy thoughts found themselves breathing easier by the time you reached the top. And it was not long before someone began calling the trail Eli's light, though he never claimed it as his own. And he simply kept walking it each day, checking each lamp with fingers grown deft and steady, and the bell above welcomed him like an old friend. And when May the baker's daughter brought him a new scarf, this one the color of early spring, he wore it without a word, but his smile told her everything. And so it was that in time the bell was no longer the only sound that marked the heart of the village. There were other bells, smaller, softer, carried on wrists, and tied to cloaks or sewn into door curtains, not to warn, but to remind, to sing gently of presence and place. And when visitors came, they too received these bells as gifts, tokens of welcome, not meant to bind but to bless. And the wind caught them and scattered, sung across the village like lullabies. And Eli, now tall and quiet, and sure was the one many came to when they first arrived, not because he offered answers, but because he listened, and sometimes that was all anyone needed. And Rowan, watching him from the long hall, knew that the bell had chosen again, not by voice or vision, but by rhythm, and that Eli's steady care was its own kind of chime. And one evening during the first melt of spring, when the snow dripped from the eaves like slow music, Eli found a small bundle on the bench beneath the bell, wrapped in a scarf, not unlike his own. And inside was a note that read, "For the keeper of lights, thank you." And beneath the note was a tiny bell carved from stone, smooth and round, with a soft tone when shaken. And he held it in his palm for a long time, feeling its weight and its silence, and he knew, without words, that the story he was living had joined with the story that came before, not as a new chapter, but as another verse in the same song. And the wind stirred, and the great bell rang once low and warm, and from the woods someone began to hum. As summer spread across the hills with a golden hush, and the skies deepened into long amber evenings, the village moved with the rhythm of warmth and quiet blooming, and the great bell hung high in its cradle of timber and ivy, watching like a silent guardian, whose voice was no longer a cry of fear but a call of presence. And it was during these long, quiet days that a woman arrived on foot, her sandals worn, her tunic travel-stained, and her eyes clear with a kind of tired hope, and her name was Nara. And though she said little, the way she walked the path up the hill told a story of distance and seeking. And when she reached the bell, she did not speak or sit or knock. Instead, she stood with her hands folded and her head bowed, as if listening not to the bell, but to something within. And when Rowan saw her, they did not ask questions, only approached with a cup of cool water and a folded cloth, and sat beside her in silence until the sun lowered behind the trees and the shadows stretched long and kind. And in time Nara whispered, "I heard it in a dream, not the bell itself, but what it meant, a sound that opens instead of closes." And Rohan nodded and said softly that it's what it became. And that night Nara slept in the loft of the long hall, her breathing even and slow, and the fire's glow brushing the beams like old light. And in the days that followed she remained quiet, moving with the grace of someone who has nothing to prove but everything to offer. And slowly she began tending the herb garden behind the hall, her fingers careful, her touch light as wind. And soon the plants flourished, not only in growth but in feeling. The garden became a place of stillness, of scents that calmed, and petals that opened only at dusk, and people began to visit it to harvest, but to sit among the thyme and chamomile and lavender and breathe, and in time. Children came too, to learn the names of leaves and the ways roots speak to soil, and Nara welcomed them with a nod or a soft hand on the shoulder, and sometimes she would hum not words, just sounds that felt like lullabies forgotten long ago. And, well, Eli watched her from the path where his lantern still glowed, and felt something like a mirror, quiet strength that did not need sound. And the two rarely spoke, but often found themselves in the same places, moving in parallel with the kind of peace that does not need explanation. And one morning, as the mist curled low along the stones, and dew clung to every leaf, Nara placed a bundle at the base of the bell wrapped in a green cloth, and inside was a small pouch of dried petals and seeds, and a note that read, "For planting. When the moon is high and the silence is deep," and Rowan found it and understood without asking. And that evening, when the moon rose round, in full, Rowan, Eli, and Nara climbed the hill and planted the seeds in a circle just beyond the bell, each taking turns to press the soil gently. And when they were done, they sat and waited, not for anything to happen, but simply to honor what they had done. And the wind stirred, and the bell did not ring, but the air shimmered slightly, as if recognizing the gesture, and in the weeks that followed, tiny shoots began to emerge, soft green curls, reaching for the sky, and people came to see them, not for spectacle, but to witness. And they brought their own seeds, not always of plants, but of memories, written on slips of cloth or drawn on stones, or whispered into the earth, and the circle grew wider, not in size, but in spirit. And the hill became a place of quiet planting, not just of things, but of intentions and prayers and hopes and regrets. And everything was welcome, and nothing was taken away. And when the petals finally bloomed under a silver sky, their colors were softer than expected, not vibrant, but muted like dreams or faded fabric, and they gave off no strong scent, only the faintest sweetness like warmth left behind. And Nara began to gather them each morning, not to keep, but to give, leaving small bundles at doorsteps, or tying them to the ends of benches, or setting them afloat on the stream that ran behind the bakeress house. And each bundle carried with it a silence not empty, but full, the kind that invited breath and thought and sleep. And slowly the people began to speak, less not from fear, but from understanding that silence had its own language, and that the bell's voice was not the only music that guided them. And so the village grew not outward but inward, becoming deeper in kindness and steadier in rhythm. And even travelers who passed through for only a night would leave with softened shoulders and eyes that blinked slower, as if waking from a long dream. And in time, others came not by accident but by choice, having heard of a place where bells were not alarms but lullabies. And Rowan, now older with laugh lines carved deep in eyes that gleamed like water under moonlight, watched all of this with a quiet heart, knowing that what had once been a warning had become a welcome, and that what had once divided now held in one evening. As the stars turned slowly overhead, Rowan stood beneath the bell alone, and reached up to rest their fingers on the wood, and whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to everything." And the wind blew soft across the hill, and the bell rang once low and deep like the earth breathing. And in the long hall someone began to hum, and others joined, not with harmony, but with presence. And the fire crackled, and stories waited at the edges, ready to be told, not for memory, but for rest. The quiet of the village settled over everything like a soft blanket pulled up to the chin, and in that silence each breath became a thread, woven into the fabric of the evening. And the gentle rustle of leaves whispered stories only the heart could understand. And the bell above the hill hung steady and true, a sentinel not of warning but of welcome. And as twilight deepened, the people gathered in the long hall, where firelight danced across wooden beams, casting shadows that moved like slow breathing, and the air was filled with the scent of herbs dried and fresh, and the quiet murmur of voices lowered in calm conversation. And among them sat Rowan, now aged like the oak outside, whose roots ran deep and whose branches reached wide. And beside them sat Eli, whose hands had grown sure and kind from tending the light along the path, and Nara, whose eyes held the secret softness of the garden she nurtured behind the hall. And the three shared the space, not as leaders, but as keepers of a story older than themselves, a story made not of words, alone, but of presence and listening and gentle remembering. And as the night grew deeper, Rowan began to speak not loudly, but with a voice that carried like a soft wind through the hall, telling of days long past when the bell once called out not to gather but to part, and how from those days had grown a new kind of song, a song made from patience and care and the willingness to see others not as threat, but as neighbor. And the story wound around the room, wrapping the listeners like a shawl, warming and familiar. And when Rowan paused, the fire crackled in answer, and the room seemed to breathe with them. And Eli took up the thread, showing how the path of light had grown from small lanterns to many small flames, each one a symbol of hope held quietly in the hands of the people. And Nara shared the meaning of the garden, a place not just for herbs, but for healing, for silence, for the unspoken prayers that flowers carried to the sky. And together they spoke of the bell's voice moving beyond sound into spirit, into the spaces between heartbeats, and the listeners leaned in not just to hear, but to feel. And among those gathered were children who sat wide-eyed and still, as if tasting a sweetness they could not yet name, and elders whose eyes glistened with quiet tears, not of sorrow, but of understanding. And as the story wound down, the bell above the hill rang once, soft and low, its sound a warm blanket wrapping the village in peace. And the people rose slowly, one by one, moving toward the doors and the stars outside, where the night held a promise of rest and renewal. And Rowan stood last, watching the fire's glow fade and the embers settle like the memories they held. And in that moment a breeze stirred the curtains and carried a faint scent of lavender and pine, and the distant call of an owl like a benediction for the journey ahead. And as Rowan stepped out into the cool night air, the sky stretched wide above them, deep and endless. And for a moment they lifted their face to the stars and let the silence fill them. And somewhere far beyond the village, on a road winding through the dark, a traveler paused beneath the same stars and heard a soft ringing carried on the wind, not a warning but a song. And they smiled and took a step forward, and the story carried on like a river flowing slow and steady, shaping the land with kindness and patience and light. And in that flow all were welcome, all were seen, all were home. The dawn broke slowly over the village, casting a gentle blush across the rooftops and the fields and the distant hills, where the first light brushed the grass with a touch like whispered promises. And the air held the fresh scent of earth and dew, and the soft song of morning birds waking from their quiet dreams. And the traveler, who now belonged fully to this place, stirred in their small cottage, wrapped in a woolen blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and pine. And as they sat up, their fingers brushed the smooth wood of the windowsill, feeling the coolness beneath their skin. And outside the world was waking in slow, deliberate rhythms, the leaves swaying softly with a breeze that moved like a sigh through the branches. And the distant sound of the village bell calling the morning, and rang clear and steady, a sound no longer carrying fear, but the calm certainty of another day, unfolding gently like a story written not in words but in moments. And the traveler breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill their lungs and steady their heart. And as they rose to dress, they moved with the ease of someone who has learned to listen to the subtle language of the world around them, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the hum of life stirring softly beyond the walls. And stepping outside, they were greeted by the warmth of the sun now climbing higher, the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging greetings, the smell of fresh bread baking, and the distant laughter of children playing in the lanes between cottages. And the traveler smiled quietly, knowing that this was home, not because of walls or fences, but because of the gentle rhythms of belonging, the shared moments of kindness, the unspoken promise of safety carried in the sound of the bell. And as the day stretched forward, they moved among the people, offering a helping hand, a kind word, a patient ear, and receiving in return the simple gifts of gratitude and companionship. And when evening came with its slow, deepening shadows, the traveler found themselves once more beneath the great bell on the hill, the sky a canvas painted with fading pinks and purples and stars, beginning to blink awake like tiny lanterns scattered across velvet. And they lifted the mallet gently and struck the bell once, just once, and the sound rolled over the land, soft and round, and full like a whispered blessing, carried on the breath of the wind. And in That moment the traveler felt the pulse of all who had come before and all who would follow, a thread weaving through time unbroken and unbreakable, and as the last light faded, they closed their eyes and let themselves be carried away. On the tide of that sound, a sound not of warning but of welcome and belonging in the story, continued flowing slow and steady like the river that carved the valley deep and wide, and beneath the hush of the night the village rested, wrapped in the calm embrace of the bell's gentle song. And somewhere far beyond the hills, a new traveler walked beneath the stars and heard that sound and smiled and took a step forward. The morning mist lingered softly over the village as the first hints of sunlight filtered through the tall trees, and the world seemed to hold its breath in that fragile moment between night and day, and the traveler awoke, feeling the calm weight of sleep still clinging gently to their limbs. And the distant call of the bell echoed faintly through the valley, a sound not sharp or urgent but slow and steady, like a heartbeat shared by all who listened, and wrapped in a shawl woven with threads of soft gray and green, they stepped outside onto the cool earth, feeling the dew dampen their bare feet and the scent of pine mingling with the faint sweetness of wildflowers. And as they walked the familiar path toward the hill, the leaves rustled softly overhead as if whispering secrets only the wind could carry, and the traveler paused beneath the ancient oak tree, whose branches stretched wide and gnarled like the arms of time itself, and closed, their eyes letting the breeze move through their hair and the quiet settle into their bones. And in that stillness they felt the presence of those who had come before and those who would come after, a chain of voices humming beneath the surface of the earth, a song that held pain and healing, fear and hope, all braided together in a gentle harmony. And continuing on the path, they reached the bell, standing tall and steady, framed by ivy and wildflowers and ribbons left by villagers as offerings of remembrance and welcome. And as they lifted the mallet and struck the bell once, the sound rose clear and soft, a deep note that rolled through the hills and valleys and carried with it a message not of warning, but of gathering, of belonging. And the traveler listened to the fading echoes, feeling the warmth of connection spread through their chest. And when the village bell rang again later that day, it called people not to fear, but to share a meal, to tell stories, to heal wounds, both seen and unseen. And the traveler found themselves seated among friends, beneath the glow of lanterns, their voices low and steady, weaving together memories and dreams like threads in a tapestry, and children nestled close, eyes heavy with sleep as the old tales wove their gentle magic around them. And as the fire crackled and the night deepened, the traveler felt the quiet peace that comes from knowing that no matter the shadows that may have once fallen here, the light now held sway. And somewhere beyond the village borders, the soft ringing of the bell carried on the wind, calling others to this place of rest and welcome. And in that sound was the promise of home, and the traveler closed their eyes, once more allowing the lull of the bell song to carry them softly into dreams deep and untroubled, where the story continued unfolding like petals of a night flower opening slowly to the moonlight. The village lay quiet beneath, the sky brushed with the soft blush of dawn, and the traveler wandered through the empty streets, where the scent of damp earth and wood smoke mingled with the faint perfume of blooming wildflowers. And the gentle breeze moved like a whispered caress through the branches of the old oaks and maples standing sentinel along the cobblestone paths. And in that silence the traveler felt a deep calm settle into their bones like a slow tide drawing the shore. And as they made their way toward the hill, the high bell stood silhouetted against the waking sky, framed by ivy and moss, and the ribbons tied by many hands fluttering softly like silent prayers. And beneath it, the circle of stones lay worn smooth by time and footsteps, and the traveler paused, their hand resting lightly on the wooden frame of the bell, feeling its cool surface beneath their palm. And when they lifted the mallet to strike it once, the sound that rose was neither harsh nor urgent, but a rich, rounded note that seemed to ripple through the very air itself, settling gently over the valley and far beyond the village and towns and hamlets and lonely crossroads. The sound reached ears ready to receive it, not as alarm, but as invitation. And as the echoes faded, the traveler closed their eyes, breathing in the deep stillness that followed the bell's call. And when they opened them again, the village was stirring. Slowly, people stepping out of their homes, pulling on cloaks and lighting lamps, and children stretching and yawning with sleepy smiles. and the traveler joined them, moving easily among the familiar faces, offering a nod here, a smile there, and when evening came, the village gathered once more in the long hall. Beneath the warm glow of lanterns and the crackle of the fire, and stories were told, old and new, weaving a tapestry of memory and hope and belonging, and the traveler listened deeply as voices rose and fell, each one a thread in the fabric of the village. Soul and outside the night wrapped the village in a blanket of quiet stars, and the bell rang one soft, clear note that carried like a breath across the hills, and the traveler, with eyes heavy but heart light, felt the gentle pull of sleep drawing near, and somewhere far beyond the village. A new traveler heard that soft ringing and smiled, knowing that the story was not ending, but only beginning, anew like the first light of dawn, touching the earth with promise. And in that knowledge they stepped forward into the unknown. With a calmness born of the bell's gentle song, the gentle light of dawn spilled softly over the village rooftops, and the traveler rose from their resting place. Beneath the ancient oak, where the earth was cool and fragrant with moss and fallen leaves, and as they stretched their limbs they felt the lingering calm of sleep still woven into their muscles like a slow melody, and the distant sound of the bell drifted faintly through the morning air, a low and soothing note that seemed to carry the weight of centuries and the promise of new beginnings. And wrapped in a shawl spun from the softest wool, the travelers stepped onto the path that wound gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way the wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like a dream, remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could understand. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm around. Note that rolled slowly across the hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it. And the traveler closed, their eyes feeling the pulse of connection that stretched through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved in gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a drum heard from afar. And children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting through the air, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around the listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs filled the air, mingling with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars. And the traveler sat among the circle of friends, listening deeply to tales told, not just with words, but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang again, once soft and clear its voice. A lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest, and somewhere far beyond the hills a new journey began as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with a calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The village lay wrapped in the soft glow of twilight as the traveler wandered slowly through the quiet lanes where the scent of wood smoke, mingled with the faint fragrance of wild herbs in the leaves, rustled gently overhead, stirred by a breeze that carried whispers of stories long told and untold. And as the traveler made their way toward the hill, the great bell stood, silhouetted against the fading light, framed by ivy and ribbons left by those who came before, like silent prayers fluttering softly in the evening air. And beneath the bell, the circle of stones lay worn smooth by countless footsteps, and the traveler paused, their fingers tracing the cool wood of the bell's frame, feeling its steady, its presence beneath their touch. And when they raised the mallet and struck the bell, once the sound that blossomed was rich and warm, a deep note that rolled gently across the hills and valleys, carrying with it a message not of warning, but of welcome and belonging. And the echoes faded slowly, and the traveler closed their eyes, breathing in the stillness that followed the bell's call. And when they opened them, the village was stirring as lights flickered in windows, and people emerged from their homes, pulling on shawls and cloaks, and children stretched and yawned their eyes, heavy with sleep. And the traveler moved easily among familiar faces, offering nods and smiles that spoke of quiet connection. And when evening came, the village gathered once more in the long hall beneath the warm glow of lanterns. And the crackle of the fire, and stories were shared, old and new, weaving a tapestry of memory and hope. And the traveler listened deeply as voices rose and fell, each one a thread in the fabric of the village's soul. And outside, the night wrapped the village in a blanket of quiet stars, and the bell rang one soft, clear note that carried like a breath across the hills, and the traveler, with eyes heavy but heart light, felt the gentle pull of sleep drawing near and somewhere far beyond the village. A new traveler heard that soft ringing and smiled, knowing that the story was not ending but only beginning, anew like the first light of dawn, touching the earth with promise, and in that knowledge they stepped forward into the unknown with a calmness born of the bell's gentle song. The village awoke slowly under a sky painted with pale hues of dawn, and the traveler rose from their resting place, where the cool earth met soft moss and the scent of pine and wildflowers wrapped around them like a gentle embrace. And as they stepped onto the path winding up the hill, the gentle rustle of leaves whispered secrets only the wind could carry, and the bell stood tall and steady, framed by ivy and wild blooms. And the traveler paused, hand resting lightly on the smooth wood before raising the mallet to strike once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across the hills and valleys, carrying a message not of fear but of welcome and belonging. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the thread of connection stretching through time and space, weaving past, present, and future into one steady breath. And the village moved through the day in gentle rhythms, low voices and laughter mingling softly like a lullaby, and children played quietly in lanes, their smiles light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared tales by the fire, their words wrapping listeners like a soft quilt of wisdom and memory. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bell rang once more, soft and clear its voice, a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting rest, and somewhere far beyond the hills a new journey began, as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt hope stir deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. And the night wrapped the village in peaceful quiet, and the fire crackled low, and the bell, soft ringing, hummed through the trees like a heartbeat shared by all who listened. And the story flowed on, steady and sure, like the slow river shaping the land with kindness and light. And in that flow, everyone was welcome, everyone was seen, everyone was home. The early morning light spilled gently across the village rooftops, and the traveler awoke beneath the canopy of ancient oaks, where moss clung soft and green, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the faint hint of lavender carried on a breeze that moved like a whisper through the branches. And as they rose, their fingers brushed the cool wood of the windowsill, and the distant call of the bell floated faintly through the valley, a sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady like a heartbeat shared by all who listened. And wrapped in a shawl woven from threads of soft gray and green, they stepped onto the path. And along the way, wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like a dream half remembered. And the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across the hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it.
Aye.
And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved in gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around the listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars. And the traveler sat among friends, listening deeply to tales told, not just with words, but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang again, once soft and clear its voice, a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest. And somewhere far beyond the hills, a new journey began, as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stir deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The soft light of dawn crept slowly over the village, and the traveler stirred beneath the ancient oak tree, where the earth smelled sweet with moss and fallen leaves, and the cool air held. The faint scent of pine and wildflowers mingling with the first songs of waking birds, and as they rose, their fingers brushed the smooth wood of the windowsill, feeling the coolness against their skin, and the distant bell call drifted softly through the valley. A sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady like a heartbeat shared by all who listened, and wrapped in a shawl woven of soft, gray and green threads, they stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way the wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like dreams half remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars, and the traveler sat among friends listening deeply to tales told not just with words but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest. And somewhere far beyond the hills a new journey began, as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within, and they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The village lay wrapped in the soft embrace of twilight, as the traveler wandered slowly through the quiet lanes, where the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint fragrance of wild herbs, and the leaves rustled gently overhead, stirred by a breeze that carried whispers of stories long told and untold. And as the traveler made their way toward the hill, the great bell stood, silhouetted against the fading light framed by ivy and ribbons left by those came before, like silent prayers fluttering softly in the evening air. And beneath the bell, the circle of stones lay worn smooth by countless footsteps, and the traveler paused, their fingers tracing the cool wood of the bell's frame, feeling its steady presence beneath their touch. And when they raised the mallet and struck the bell, once the sound that blossomed was rich and warm, a deep note that rolled gently across the hills and valleys, carrying with it a message not of warning, but of welcome and belonging. And the echoes faded slowly, and the traveler closed their eyes, breathing in the stillness that followed the bell's call. And when they opened them, the village was stirring as lights flickered in windows, and people emerged from their homes pulling on shawls and cloaks, and children stretched and yawned, their eyes heavy with sleep. And the traveler moved easily among familiar faces, offering nods and smiles that spoke of quiet connection. And when evening came, the village gathered once more in the long hall beneath the warm glow of lanterns, and the crackle of the fire, and stories were shared, old and new, weaving a tapestry of memory and hope and belonging. And the traveler listened deeply as voices rose and fell, each one a thread in the fabric of the village. A soul, and outside the night wrapped the village in a blanket of quiet stars, and the bell rang one soft, clear note that carried like a breath across the hills. And the traveler, with eyes heavy but heart light, felt the gentle pull of sleep drawing near. And somewhere far beyond the village, a new traveler heard that soft ringing and smiled, knowing that the story was not ending, but only beginning anew, like the first light of dawn, touching the earth with promise. And in that knowledge they stepped forward into the unknown with a calmness born of the bell's gentle song. The early morning light filtered softly through the tall trees surrounding the village, and the traveler awoke beneath the canopy of ancient oaks, where moss blanketed the earth like a plush carpet, and the air was thick with the fresh scent of damp leaves and the faint trace of wildflowers mingling with pine. And as they rose, their fingers brushed the cool wood of the windowsill, feeling the smoothness against their skin, and the distant bell call drifted faintly through the valley, sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady, like a heartbeat shared by all who listened and wrapped in a shawl woven from soft gray and green threads. They stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way, wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like dreams half-remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hour, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars. And the traveler sat among friends, listening deeply to tales told, not just with words, but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest. And somewhere far beyond the hills, a new journey began, as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The village rested quietly beneath a sky brushed with the soft hues of dawn, and the traveler stirred gently beneath the ancient oak where moss lay, thick and green like a velvet carpet. In the air was rich with the scent of damp earth, and the faint trace of lavender carried on a breeze that moved like a whispered secret through the branches. And as they rose, their fingers brushed the smooth wood of the windowsill, feeling the coolness against their skin, and the distant call of the bell drifted softly through the valley, a sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady like a heartbeat shared by all who listened and wrapped in a shawl woven from threads of soft gray and green. They stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way, wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like dreams half-remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze. And elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars. And the traveler sat among friends, listening deeply to tales told not just with words, but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest. And somewhere far beyond the hills, a new journey began, as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stir deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The first light of morning stretched slowly across the village rooftops as the traveler awoke beneath the protective branches of the ancient oak tree where moss blanketed the earth like a plush carpet, and the air was thick with the fresh scent of damp leaves and the faint trace of wildflowers mingling with pine. And as they rose, their fingers brushed the cool wood of the windowsill, feeling the smoothness against their skin, and the distant bell call drifted faintly through the valley, sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady like a heartbeat shared by all who listened and wrapped in a shawl woven from soft gray. In green threads they stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence. And along the way, wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender, like dreams half-remembered, in the leaves. Above whispered secrets only the wind could carry, and when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it, and the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady, like the beat of a distant drum. And children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars, and the traveler sat among friends listening deeply to tales told, not just with words but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest and somewhere far beyond the hills. New journey began as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within, and they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The village lay quietly beneath the gentle light of dawn as the traveler stirred beneath the canopy of ancient oaks, where moss blanketed the earth like a soft green carpet, and the air was thick with the fresh scent of damp leaves and the faint trace of wildflowers, mingling with pine, and as they rose, their fingers brushed the cool wood of the windowsill, feeling the smoothness against their skin, and the distant call of the bell drifted softly through the valley, a sound not sharp or urgent, but low and steady, like a heartbeat shared by all who listened, and wrapped in a shawl woven from soft gray and green threads. They stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like dreams half-remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, they raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm around, note rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it, and the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly in the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall, the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars, and the traveler sat among friends listening deeply to tales told, not just with words but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest, and somewhere far beyond the hills. A new journey began as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within, and they stepped forward into the unfolding story. With calmness born of the bell's timeless song, the village lay quietly beneath the gentle light of dawn as the traveler stirred beneath the canopy of ancient oaks, where moss blanketed the earth like a soft green carpet, and the air was thick with the fresh scent of damp leaves and the faint trace of wildflowers, mingling with pine, and as they rose, their fingers brushed the cool wood of the windowsill, feeling the smoothness against their skin, and the distant call of the bell drifted softly through the valley, sound not sharp or urgent but low and steady, like a heartbeat shared by all who listened, and wrapped in a shawl woven from soft gray and green threads. They stepped onto the winding path that led gently up the hill, their feet touching the earth with quiet reverence, and along the way, wildflowers nodded softly in the breeze, their colors muted and tender like dreams half-remembered, and the leaves above whispered secrets only the wind could carry. And when the traveler reached the bell standing tall against the pale sky, They raised the mallet and struck it once, just once, and the sound that bloomed was deep and warm, a round note, rolling gently across hills and valleys, settling softly into the hearts of all who heard it. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a single breath. And as the day unfolded, the village moved with gentle rhythms, the hum of voices low and steady, like the beat of a distant drum, and children played quietly. In the lanes, their laughter light as feathers drifting on the breeze, and elders shared stories by the hearth, their words, weaving threads of wisdom and memory that wrapped around listeners like a soft quilt. And in the long hall the fire crackled, and the scent of herbs mingled with the soft glow of lanterns that flickered like tiny stars. And the traveler sat among friends, listening deeply to tales told, not just with words, but with presence and heart. And when night fell, the bell rang once more, soft and clear, its voice a lullaby carried on the breeze, inviting all to rest, and somewhere far beyond the hills a new journey began as a lone traveler heard that gentle sound and felt a quiet hope stirred deep within. And they stepped forward into the unfolding story with calmness born of the bell's timeless song. The evening sky deepened into a blanket of indigo, and stars twinkled softly like distant lanterns as the village settled into a hush wrapped in the gentle embrace of night, and the traveler found themselves once more beneath the ancient oak tree, where the cool earth smelled sweet with moss and wildflowers, and the air held the faint scent of pine mingling with the whisper of wind through the leaves. And as they lifted the mallet and struck the bell, just once the sound that rose was deep and tender, a single note that rolled like a wave across the hills and valleys, carrying with it the stories of all who had listened before. And the traveler closed their eyes, feeling the pulse of connection stretching through time and space, linking past and present and future into a gentle breath. And all around the village the soft glow of lanterns flickered like tiny stars, and the fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows upon faces filled with quiet joy. And voices rose and fell, and stories shared, and songs hummed low like a lullaby woven from the threads of hope and healing and belonging. And in that peaceful moment the traveler felt a profound calm settle deep within, knowing that no matter the fears or shadows that had once passed through this place, the light now held sway, and the bell's soft ringing carried out into the night a timeless promise that wherever the path may lead, all are welcome, all are safe, all are home. And as the traveler turned slowly toward the darkened path that led away from the village, their heart was light, their step gentle, and the story of the Castle Leper Bell whispered softly on the breeze, a lullaby for all who listen, a call to rest and peace and belonging. And with that sound carried into the night, the traveler walked on into the quiet unknown, wrapped in the gentle song of the bell.